This little camera is going to be my first step into film. Needless to say, I don't know if everything is going to go as planned. As a colorist and filmmaker, I've been chasing the elusive film look my entire career. We want our videos to look like the movies we love, right? And there will always be someone that says, if you want it to look like film, why don't you just actually shoot on film? And some productions have. Take, for instance, Euphoria Season 2, which was shot on Ektachrome, or Dune, which was shot digitally, but then printed on film to achieve that authentic look. So I wondered, what am I missing from shooting on actual film? I mean, we want to create a product that closes this gap in Cinema Grade, our grading plugin, but how can you understand the look of film if you've never actually experienced it firsthand? I've never actually done it. I know that it's expensive, sometimes requiring a crew, and I'm afraid I'm gonna screw something up. And then this came out. The new Kodak Super 8mm film camera, a camera with all the bells and whistles of today's technology. Audio recording on an SD card with crystal sync, an LCD viewfinder with aspect ratio overlays and digital menus, HDMI output for external monitors, and overall a pretty slick modern design. 8mm, particularly this little camera, is expensive, but it's relatively cheap compared to the larger film formats. I mean, I could have rented a 35mm motion picture camera and a professional operator, but I didn't want to be stuck on the sideline. I want to be hands-on. I even considered just shooting stills on CineStill film, which uses the very same motion picture film stock, but then I felt like I'd be missing the essence of capturing moving images. I wanted the real deal, and I wanted to experience it for myself. The new Kodak Super 8 camera costs $5,495, which may seem like a lot of money for an 8mm camera, but if you adjust for inflation, it's comparable to what a top model would have cost 40 years ago. Of course, you can find plenty of Super 8s on eBay from the 70s and 80s for a few $100, but these are essentially vintage cameras with foggy viewfinders, worn out motors, lens with fungus, and all kinds of issues. So I said to myself, if I'm gonna shoot on film, I wanna do it in the best possible conditions. The day the big brown box from B&H showed up, I felt like a kid on Christmas. The packaging is sleek and the quick start guide is straightforward. It comes equipped with a C-mount lens, battery, and a complimentary roll of black and white Tri-X film. So right away, I ordered an assortment of film. I ordered 50D, 200T, 500T, and for the fun of it, some Ektachrome. As soon as the film arrived, I went out to shoot. The camera feels familiar and approachable thanks to the LCD viewfinder. This is great for framing and changing menu settings, though I will say you don't want to use it to judge exposure or focus, and it is low resolution. It does, however, have a built-in light meter, which is displayed on the left side of the viewfinder. It tells you if you're under or overexposed, but I did also find it a little bit tricky to get it right in the center. I had been told as a rule of thumb that you want to overexpose film by one stop, as this makes the colors more rich and dynamic. Plus, film tends to handle detail in the highlights better than in the shadows. To know how to do this, since I couldn't judge f-stops using the built-in meter, I downloaded the Light Meter app on the App Store. Now, one huge relief I discovered shooting motion picture film as it relates to setting exposure is everything is mostly fixed. You choose your film stock based on lighting conditions, and you have a fixed 180-degree shutter angle or 1/48 of a second. All that you then need to worry about is the f-stop on the lens, since that's the only thing that you can change. So say for instance, you load 50D film, which is the equivalent of 50 ISO for bright daylight. You can then set 50 for the ISO in the meter, shutter speed to 1/48, the only option the camera has, and then your light meter tells you what to set your f-stop to on the lens, be it 2.4, 5.6, f8, etc. So if you want one stop over, then you just need to open up the lens by one stop. So f8 would become 5.6, 5.6 would become f4, and so on. With everything framed, properly exposed, and in focus, fingers crossed, then came the moment of truth. There's something oddly satisfying and nerve-wracking squeezing the trigger for the first time. Hearing the mechanical shutter and seeing the flicker from the shutter on the LCD screen as the film is intermittently exposed while still maintaining a live video feed. Now, one unexpected surprise I found in using this camera was the ability to log the film cartridges. This turned out to be really useful because I would swap out different film cartridges depending on the lighting conditions, and because that information is stored about each cartridge, when I went back to a previous cartridge, it would remember how much time was left on that roll. That's certainly not something you're gonna find with an old camera. Now, a big drawback I did encounter shooting on film, and I did know this in advance, is how little time you get with each cartridge. If say you shoot 24 frames per second, you only get about 2.5 minutes per roll. So you have to be really selective about the moments that you want to capture. Besides shooting a variety of different things in different lighting conditions and getting my feet wet, it was now time to focus on the color response and see how film compares to digital. To do this, we set up some test charts so we could compare the different film stocks to my Sony f3 and Blackmagic Ursa and Pocket camera. If you're wondering what in the heck in the world is this Sony f3, not to be confused with the Sony FX3 or FX30, it's one of the first Sony Cine Alta cameras that has some of the original color science and DNA dating back to when engineers were first trying to match the look of film. I think for this reason, it's more film-like as we're still making the transition away from film. Now with the film in the can, or I should say in the plastic cartridge, it's now time to send it off to the lab for processing and scanning. Originally, this part really intimidated me, but the good news is there's actually a film lab called Cinelab just a couple hours drive away, just south of Boston. Now, normally what you do is you'd mail or ship your film off to the lab, but I actually wanted to see the process for myself. Rob, the owner of Cinelab, was gracious enough to allow us to capture some video of the facility and answered all of my questions about the process. It's crazy. It's this big industrial process where the film is washed and bathed in chemicals, some parts in total darkness, before you get something back that you can see and edit. The result is this color negative where the image is inverted. It only looks like the original if it's converted in post or printed onto a positive film print for projection. The exception being Ektachrome, which uses a different chemical process, and we did shoot a couple rolls. But the processing is only the first part. The film then needs to be digitally scanned frame by frame, and the cost alone of scanning can often exceed the cost of processing. A whole separate video could be devoted to the scanning hardware, which can cost in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, but what you end up with is a digital archival version of the film in 2K, 3K, whatever you specify on the order form. The processed film then gets shipped back. The digital version is loaded onto a drive if you provided one, and or uploaded to Dropbox or Google Drive. So after leaving the lab, I waited. 1 week went by, then 2. Finally, after 3 weeks, the processed and digitized mail arrived by UPS. Everything was building up to this one moment. How would it turn out? What if I did something wrong? Did I expose the film properly? My breathing got rapid and my blood pressure spiked as I plugged in the drive. And this is what I got. It looks amazing. That is, all except for this. Okay, so what happened here? Well, it turns out there was an issue. There's this weird kind of film scratch down the center, and then it's like the film is getting peeled off and collecting in the film gate over here, creating this stringy buildup, kind of like hair. At first, this was a cause for some concern, but the lab owner, Rob, was great about putting me in touch with Kodak and their support team. They reached out to me on a Zoom call, and what we concluded based on how I was swapping out film cartridges was that I wasn't cleaning the film gate each time and checking for debris. This was compounded by the fact that I was carrying the cartridges in my jean jacket pocket where a few frames were exposed. This, we surmised, was introducing debris from my pocket, and that was getting stuck in the film gate. It is a plausible explanation, and they suggested as a solution in the future to be more mindful of how I was carrying the cartridges and use a cleaning brush and bulb blower to make sure the film gate is clean every time I swap out a cartridge. I felt like an idiot because it says right here in the manual to do this, but who reads these things anyway? Kodak, though, was kind enough to send me some complimentary cartridges, and I'll share the results from another shoot with the camera. Setting those clips aside, let's see how this color grades. I'll be using the current version of Cinema Grade as it works in Premiere, Final Cut, and DaVinci. You'll see that when working with film, it really only needs basic adjustments to exposure and color balance. Obviously, the beauty of shooting on film is it already has that filmic look, so I don't actually need to push any kind of look in the color grade. Just balance the exposure, white balance, and push the saturation. Now, for the big moment we've all been waiting for, let's see how film compares to the digital material that we shot using the test charts. Right away, the first thing you'll notice is how different they look. They are all balanced, but the colors are not quite the same. On all the film stocks, the shadows look cooler and more dense. We all talk about creating contrast with an S-curve, and here you can clearly see the knee of the curve making the shadows more pronounced. There seems to be more split toning going on too. That's why the shadows and some undertones look cooler, creating more color separation. Looking at the greens, the foliage is rendered much more green too. This varies in different degrees with each film stock, but green nonetheless. And in general, there seems to be some additional green cast in the undertones, which gets nicely mixed with the cool tones. As I said before, it is split toning like a very organic and mild version of the teal and orange look. Switching our focus to warm tones, I see red and skin tones looking more dense and rich compared to digital. What I find interesting too is the difference between the digital cameras. The Blackmagic Pocket seems more neutral, more true to life, while the old Sony f3 seems to favor warm tones. For example, grass on the f3 looks warm and saturated. On Blackmagic, it looks warm but less intense, even a bit washed out. In contrast, the grass always looks green on film. My initial suspicion on both the green tones in film and the warm tones on the f3 was to blame myself for not color balancing the shots properly. But the charts are on point, and I tried pushing other colors along the range, but still, those color casts seem to be there as part of the color science of film and the Sony camera. Every camera has its own distinct look, and each one represents color differently. Looking at the sky, the Sony f3 seems to have a bit of cyan in there, which looks remarkably close to the cyan in some of the shots captured on Ektachrome. Another great characteristic of these film stocks that I didn't expect is how beautiful the halation is with 8mm. If you look at the light reflection on the metal, it's creating a sort of bloom effect around the hot spots with a tiny bit of warmth in the edges. This is also something that we don't get with digital. So what does this all mean? Well, the main differences that we see is modern cameras offer a more neutral, true to life image, whereas film is an interpretation of reality. In other words, it captures a version of reality that is more pleasing to the eye. We get more dense, smoother looking skin tones, intense skies, shadows and highlights with texture no matter how dark or how bright they are, more separation between colors or split toning that makes the images pop, and finally light sources that have this kind of magical aura or glow to them. This test has been the first step on our mission towards the next release of Cinema Grade 2.0, where we want to give you the ability to match these kinds of characteristics in terms of film response. Not necessarily a specific film stock or emulation that's baked in that you can't change, which is a limitation with LUTs, but we want to bring to life the idea of film with the ability to have point-and-click control over the density, subtractive saturation, and halation of your images. So that in time, it'll be easier to go straight from log from any camera to a cinematic look that you're able to fine-tune. Now, obviously, if you really want the look of film, then shoot on film. We don't intend to replace that because no digital solution can. But if you desire to get that same essence without actually shooting on film, this is our dream. In terms of my first shooting experience on film, I can tell you it was as fun and exhilarating as I imagined it to be. For me, it was fulfilling a lifelong dream, and the only other real hang-up I had was the time that's involved, both in terms of how little I could actually record and how long it took to get the film back. But it's still something that I want to do. Other than that, the only other drawback is 8mm is a really small format. I mean, if you think of a single frame of film like a digital sensor, that frame size is like half the size of your pinky nail. So that gives you a really soft, lo-fi image, which is great if that's what you're going for. But ultimately, this experience has given me the confidence that I can shoot on film, and I'm now ready to step up to 16mm. So if you want to see that journey and my plan to bring this camera on a medical mission to Africa, then subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.